Okay, so this week's topic, we're moving on to look at broader work conditions. And we're lucky to be joined by two guest lecturers this week. With me here at the moment is Josh Healy, and the second two parts of this week's content will be with David Ferrugia. So we're looking at the idea of the new world of work, or do you need to choose between a life and a career? And throughout the course already, I've kind of touched upon key social changes that have happened over the past 30 or 40 years, relating it to kind of stuff about youth transitions. And really what we're looking at this week is one of the key sites of youth transitions, which is the kind of school to work transition. So we're joined here by Josh for the first part to talk about the future of work. So Josh, tell us a little bit about yourself and what your research is.
Thanks, Steve. Oh, well, hi, everyone. So I work here in the Newcastle Business School. I'm a senior lecturer in employment relations and human resource management. I teach in those areas. I also teach a course in negotiation. My research interests are broadly in the future of work. So I'm interested mainly in looking at work in the gig economy, platform companies like Uber, Deliveroo, other variations of that, and the kind of working conditions they provide. With Steve and others in the Newcastle Youth Research Centre, I'm looking at young people and work a little bit. I've had a kind of a broad interest in understanding the contours, if you like, of the future of work, and where this is going and the ways in which this is generating inequality and other bad outcomes, I suppose, for certain kinds of people.
Yeah, inequalities and how the conditions of work are kind of changing.
Absolutely.
And like they're being basically attacked across
Yeah.
a number of different sectors.
Absolutely.
So in the first part of the lecture, you've got some kind of contradictions, I suppose, to kind of take us through. So can you tell us about those?
Well, I wanted to begin, I guess, by just situating this within a debate about the future of work that's been going on for a while. And I guess you can almost sort of carbon date this to like pre and post pandemic, right? So before COVID hit, we were having a debate focused on work that was very oriented to technology. And we were talking about people were writing books and, giving lectures and worrying generally about robots and automation and the destruction of jobs and where were the jobs of the future going to come from.
Yep.
And then I guess the pandemic in a way has sort of, at least for a time, washed a lot of that away and given us an insight about technology and its limitations. And also, I guess, kind of wiped the slate clean to some extent in how we think about what are the key drivers of the future of work. And I guess what comes after this, having begun with a focus on technology, I guess I'm now arguing that, look, we need to open our eyes to a whole host of other things. Yes, technology is important, but only in the context of a wider suite of influences on what's happening to the workforce that we kind of need to be paying attention to as well. That were bubbling away, but were a bit subsumed for a while in that intent kind of focus on technology. So, as the pandemic happened, of course, if I can I go forward, or do you want to go forward? The funny thing was that, of course, we were talking about these kind of rarefied technologies that most people really didn't understand what was the impact going to be. And then what we all saw, of course, was that, it was really about very mundane kinds of technology like Zoom, that kind of remote working and video conferencing kind of technology that we'd had forever, kind of coming into much wider use and in a way, being frustrating, like, just the normal kind of prosaic, boring kind of stuff of like trying to have meetings with people when, somebody's on mute and just negotiating that. So it kind of, I think, in a way, clued us into a level of technological unsophistication that was very different to the tenor of what we were talking about, right? And it wasn't about robots. It sort of wasn't about AI, although of course now with ChatGPT and others, that's kind of now coming back into the frame. But I guess that made people rightly somewhat skeptical about technology and the extent to which this was really the principal driving sort of factor on the future of work. And it also showed us that, a technology that we'd had for a long time could suddenly be pressed into much wider use with, pretty significant implications. And I guess I want to talk a bit more about those in terms of how we now conceptualize like the boundaries of our work and the line between our work and non-work time, between, paid employment and leisure and all those kinds of things that have kind of been redefined because of 2 or 2.5 years of, working in a very different kind of way.
It's great too, because you can see like when businesses or whatever's profit line was under threat, when everyone had to stay at home, this stuff gets enrolled in very quickly.
Sure.
Overnight, basically.
Absolutely.
To keep us working.
Yeah.
But then now we might, oh, hang on, I might want to work at home a bit longer.
That's right.
It's like, oh, I get back to the office.
We don't like the
we need to discipline you by being
That's right.
So
that's right.
Yeah, we can see what the kind of motivating and underlying forces of the use of technology here aren't just kind of progress.
Yeah.
They're about control as well.
One of the things, just very quickly, about like working from home, they're like literally for decades, there'd been these predictions, right, that we were all going to be teleworking. I know that's kind of like an old-fashioned term now, but it's the same kind of phenomenon. And it literally went on with no significant increase, you know, at a pretty low level in Australia, I'm talking about, for a long, long time. And it was only, you know, the unfortunate kind of moment of the pandemic that really kind of cracked that open.
Yeah, and when it relates to things like efficiency, you know, back in the 90s, there was the idea of the paperless office.
Absolutely.
The idea that things be quicker, and then it's no, there's just more emails and letters, right? There's just right. Like more and more. So, okay, so this is another kind of interesting contradiction here, I suppose, in terms of the way that labour markets are represented, particularly around graduates.
And this plugs into, I guess, you know, the confidence that I guess we can have, or the skepticism that we should have about these kind of confident predictions about where the future of work is kind of going. So I just kind of picked up on this because it, you know, spoke to something that I was interested in about the state of the graduate market, right? So people that have just got their degrees, who are going out there looking for work. And, you know, here you see in hopefully an easily digestible form, 2 headlines from sort of major Australian newspapers, less than 2 years apart, saying, you know, diametrically opposed things about the state of the graduate job market, right? So it's terrible. Okay, this is 2020, kind of at the height of the first phase of the pandemic, and then by mid-2022, all of a sudden it's rosy, and people can expect to be snapped up into, you know, high-quality, well-paying jobs, sort of straight out of uni. So that, I think, you know, tells us that things can change quickly. And, you know, when I guess this reminds me, and hopefully you too, that when we hear people talking about what's going to happen, you know, in 5 years' time, or in 10 years' time, or in even longer time horizons, you know, we should treat that with a large kind of grain of salt. Yeah,
that's really well put. I think, like, in the same time now we have a higher education system, like, worried that not as many students are coming because the labour market conditions are kind of improved and students are choosing to get jobs instead of coming to university.
Exactly.
Okay, so in the next part of the lecture here, you've got some kind of specific factors that we need to consider about the future of work. So can you take us through that?
Absolutely. So, and this kind of comes back to what I was saying, right? So we've been preoccupied with technology, and I guess the argument here is that we don't want that to take our focus away from some other things that are also going on that are you know, also important. So one of them is just the changing kind of demographic composition of the workforce and our populations more generally. We're getting older, okay? Unfortunately, well, not for many of you listening, perhaps it won't feel like that, but on average, our societies are getting older, right? And that has interesting implications. We're seeing that in a whole bunch of areas that I'm sure you'll learn about later in this course, including in, you know, the housing market, in the ways in which our politics operate, okay? And the kind of the demographic weight of where our politics is oriented and for whose benefit. In the workforce, that's sort of equally true. Is what's happening is that we're now organizations, managers, and just ordinary working people, I guess, are contending with a much more age diverse workforce. Okay, our workforces have gotten diverse in a lot of ways, but one that perhaps doesn't get that much attention in the discourse around diversity and equity and inclusion is age. And that can kind of cut both ways, right? Of course, I've done a bit of work that looks at sort of prejudice and bias against older workers, okay, where there are expectations about, you know, who's fit to work beyond a certain kind of age, when people should start to kind of transition out of the workforce. So that's one level of it, but also it also affects people of much younger age, where there are sort of expectations that may be misplaced about what people can and should and ought to be doing. So there's kind of a, you know, I hate to kind of talk too much about the generational divide or the generational clash. A lot of that stuff is, you know, a little bit sketchy, I think. But, you know, there are interesting things, interesting dynamics around the changing age composition of our workforce that I've kind of mentioned here and written about elsewhere.
Yeah, so discrimination can start to happen to people in their 40s, right?
Absolutely.
And so what's interesting, to relate it back to the course, is that many of the markers of youth transitions of, getting your own place to live, getting married, having kids, getting full-time work, getting financial security is actually being shown to be pushing back into like the 40s.
Absolutely.
So there's a kind of discrimination.
Discrimination
against people who haven't, generally are struggling to even tick off of those markers of adulthood by that time. So,
and we've known for a long time that people like beyond a certain age, if there's a recession, it becomes phenomenally difficult to get back to where you were. We're fortunate at the moment that the labour market is sort of, or economists tell us anyway, it's sort of humming along very, very healthily. But when there are downswings, people lose their jobs and struggle to get back in. And that's, partly sort of related to their age.
Older workers are kind of less exploitable too. They know their rights a lot more, because of that factor as well. So, okay. The other thing was you kind of touched upon already in terms of technology.
And I guess what I wanted to say here is that, in thinking about technology, I guess one real area that's now sort of opened up in the last few years is kind of thinking about this idea of algorithmic management, right? And the ways in which potentially a lot of, managerial functions or roles could be sort of replaced by machines that, have information fed into them and can kind of make decisions about the allocation of resources and, the utilization of different kinds of people within different kinds of organizations. So that's kind of happening. This started, and I guess my connection to this, and probably for many of you, if you've heard about this at all, you've kind of heard about this in the context of like platform companies doing this. But we're now starting to see that same kind of technology and that same approach to its use kind of fanning out into a lot of other areas. So I think that's like a big issue. When I talk from time to time to people working in human resource management roles, who are kind of destined to go into those areas, I kind of talk about this and, ask them to think about the nature of what their roles are going to look like in the context of this kind of technology and I think this has, tremendous, like any technology, I guess it's got potential, but it's also got huge risks associated with essentially outsourcing judgment to machines that are informed by the past. Okay, and
so you're talking here about like people applying for jobs, their CVs being sorted.
That's right. That's one part of it, but also potentially like decisions about performance management when people are on the job. Who gets promoted, who gets that plum new work opportunity. Based on metrics that are sometimes pretty iffy. Okay, so all of this is based on data. There are certain things we can measure well, and there's a lot that we can't. And if we move to a form of decision making that's algorithmic and fed by these kinds of data, then we should expect that it will reproduce certain kinds of biases, right? And
there's a whole wealth of research out there, isn't there, about how our artificial intelligence and algorithms essentially always the start racist or end up racist because they're just used on the basis of the data that's fed into them, which is often based on a racist society, right?
Indeed.
So there's a whole wealth of books like about that in the other course that I run, Consumption Technology and Everyday Life. We do a whole week on this about the way that these kind of algorithms constantly have these kind of absurd biases. And the idea that here is also that technology, if it sorts, will be not biased, won't it? It'll be like clean just based on quantitative measures, but like those quantitative measures tend to be always fed into the thing, tend to be kind of biased to begin with.
That's right. That's sort of a Silicon Valley myth, I think, for the idea that this is going to be better and it's going to be cleaner and that this is an idealized kind of model of doing things. That's not a reflection of the real world.
Yep. Okay.
In my view.
So the third thing is organizational boundaries.
That's right. And I guess this ties in with what I was saying earlier on about the ways in which people's perspectives have shifted through the pandemic, right? So now, many organizations are having to deal with, changing preferences, I guess, and a sense that a different kind of working is possible. Obviously, this happened as sort of Steve said earlier on, this happened very quickly in the context of lockdowns and, people not being able to have face-to-face contact in the workplace in the pandemic. But, after adapting to that and doing that for a few years, I guess people have noticed that actually in some ways, it's quite nice. And we don't necessarily want to revert to a situation where we're working all of our time back in the office. This is developing in funny ways, right? So I just saw a story recently about, people going back into the office, but kind of like wearing noise cancelling headphones around the place. So they're not interacting in the ways that, they might have been before or that they're supposed to do, right? So things have really changed. And I guess that, that idea of how finally, after decades of talking about it, how organizations are going to manage a more remote kind of workforce where people are combining, in-office time or on-site time with time elsewhere. I think that's a huge challenge, and it might also tie in with that idea about algorithmic management, right? What kinds of technologies are we going to see rolled out to kind of surveil people, to monitor what they're doing, to check that they're doing the right thing when they're off in an environment where they can't be so easily visibly observed.
And it's at the same time too, before the pandemic, we have the idea of bullshit jobs, which is a bit of a
right on
David Graeber stuff. But it's like, he talks about how much time is actually wasted by people at work when they're at work, like, for 8 hours a day, having to pretend that they're doing something.
Sure.
It's actually better for everyone's life if you can just do that at home and not have to pretend, right? And just still do your job, right?
Indeed.
So there's like really interesting things going on here. That's much about control and surveillance as it is about productivity.
Yeah.
Because as I think that I saw you speak at once, you were kind of talking about how even places that have the 4-day week tend to be as productive and profitable as those that have 5-day week.
Yeah, that's right.
What happens in the 4-day week is people stop just pretending to work. So there's like a bunch of really interesting things that are kind of left out of this.
Well, there's been a lot of pushback because, one thing that clearly does drive this is that, organizations have facilities that are otherwise dormant. They're, paying.
It's about real estate.
It's about real estate. Yeah, that's right. So we're not the first people to say that.
That's right. Okay, so another big thing, obviously, that's hanging over all this is climate change.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, and again,
on the labour market.
Yeah, well, I guess again, I'm kind of no climate scientist, and we all know that climate change is kind of happening. And I guess there's, again, the need to kind of incorporate this into our thinking about future of work, right? Because, that's kind of not going away. We know that it's getting worse if we stay on this kind of path of, status quo. Business as usual isn't going to cut it. So I guess this also plays into it. And I guess in a way, this, again, kind of links back to those other things, right? Is technology going to enable us to work in ways that might, help us to limit our emissions? Are we going to just, continue to kind of fund the kind of industries and the kinds of jobs that we know are contributing to this global problem? So I think, again, by and large, there has been some interesting work, but I think by and large, those that are thinking about future of work, those that are studying the labour market, kind of haven't got up to speed with kind of contemplating what the impact of climate change is going to be, sitting as a kind of umbrella over much of this other stuff. I think, in the longer term, it's going to be much more important probably than a lot of these technologies that we've been talking most about.
Yeah. And so, and relating here to kind of the way economics is represented in our country, again, the dominance of mining and many of these industries that probably do need to be sunsetted, for whatever the way to put it. Right. As much of the research shows, people think that they have much more impact on the economy than they actually do, right? So like, you ask what percentage of GDP the mining industry is, people say 20, 25%, when it's somewhere probably between 2 and 8 of all this kind of stuff.
A tiny percent of the workforce, that's for sure.
So the need to kind of change, it's often couched against this kind of economic disaster if that's the case, but it's not really so much the case, right? Like, and BHP disappeared out of Newcastle in the 90s, and Newcastle is still a fairly prosperous place. So the imagination of the future here is often fundamentally affected by the way that things are represented, and particularly the way the economy is represented in our media.
Yep.
Okay, so to conclude this part, the reading this week is kind of, as you've gestured towards, you're interested in the way gig work and platform economies are kind of a very new and important and kind of, I suppose, misunderstood aspect of the future of work. But what's interesting about gig economies is they only really work if consumers use them.
Yeah.
So you've done some really interesting research with people that use the platforms, attitudes towards them.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's right. Well, I guess, with these, with the gig economy and with these kind of platform companies, they involve different parties, right? And we obviously, there's the companies themselves, like Uber being the kind of most visible case, I guess. But then you've got people who are doing work on these platforms. Then you've got, there are people like probably many of you and us occasionally who are, purchasing services, paying for things to be done, for us to get a lift or to get a meal delivered. And so I've done a bit of research that kind of tries to understand the perspective of that user group, okay? Because obviously they're important to platform companies. They want to build up a big user population. They want to keep them sweet. They want them to be feeling that they're getting a good service. And I guess the argument has been, or what we've been interested in is, what do people using these services know about the work? Okay, what do they think about the quality of the work, if anything? They have strong feelings about that, actually, as this slide shows. And could that then be used, I guess, to drive an agenda around making working conditions better? We know that people working on platforms, have pretty dire working conditions a lot of the time. It's not well-paid work. It can be unsafe. There's a lot of surveillance going on, and generally, we wouldn't consider these good jobs, right? So this is a question about whether consumers could contribute to changing that. So there's information on that previous slide and in the article that Steve has recommended you read as part of this week's course. And I guess we've been looking at that, among other things, looking at the distinction between people that do use and don't use these services. Might surprise you to know that not everybody actually uses these services. Many people do, and in particular, of course, younger people do. They use them extensively. And I guess this shows one thing that this tries to unpick is those patterns of use. Okay, so we see here, for instance, that young people are much more prevalent kind of users of a range of different platform types. This breaks down 6 different types of platforms. You see that regular use of things like meal delivery. This is recent data from 2022. That really sort of stands out. And this kind of matters because our research shows that those that are more prevalent users also tend to be more positive. Okay, they tend to rate the work more favorably. Okay, so there's a kind of a thing going on here that means that, and we're still thinking about what that means, but it sort of suggests that there's a relationship between use and favorability towards these platforms that sort of impacts on the readiness of people to participate in and support, campaigns for better working conditions.
Yep.
So there's more in that article. I won't bang on anymore about that now. Hope that's of interest to you all.
Yeah. So can you sum up? Can you just kind of, not sum up the future of work in a couple of seconds, but
that would be impossible.
What are the main kind of takeouts you'd like the watchers of this to kind of consider when thinking about the future of work?
I guess I would sort of circle back to what I was saying about technology. So I think we do need to pay attention to what's happening on the technological side. At the moment, of course, the AI thing's back in the frame. We're kind of worrying about, or speculating a bit about where that's going and what that might mean. I guess my takeout or my encouragement to you is to see that as just one part of a larger story, okay? And to, I guess, when we're contemplating where work is going and what opportunities there might be for each of us in the future workforce, to be mindful of some of these other things as well, and not let us be kind of blinded by a kind of a focus on the new shiny technologies that happen to be on the scene at any given moment.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Josh.
Okay. Thanks, Steve.